My name is Ines Bellina. I'm a full-time writer and translator, part-time comedian. For those who consider Chani Nicholas a religion, I'm a Gemini sun, Gemini moon, and Virgo rising. I'm the cliched elderly millennial who is as well-versed in post-colonial theory as I am in the Bravo universe. And I have one existential question. Should I stay or should I go? You may have some follow-up questions. First, stay where? Here in Peru, where I'm from. More specifically in Lima, the capital city. Technically my hometown, though that's debatable. I wasn't born there. I was born in Switzerland to diplomat parents from Peru. By international law, I'm Peruvian by birth, and by Swiss law, I am nothing to them. They're one of those countries that apply jus sanguinis, which is not a fancy way of saying you want your steak rare. It means they only grant citizenship by right of blood, meaning you need Swiss parents to be Swiss. That wasn't me. You probably have more questions. Well, go back where? Switzerland? No. Go back to the United States, where I lived for 18 years before moving back to Peru in 2024. 18 years, the bulk of my adult life. I moved back to Peru willingly, but since I'm also a US citizen, I can go back to the United States if I want. Should be easy enough, right? Sounds like I can easy breezy stay here in Lima or go back to the US on a whim. But the reality is much more complicated. I need you to know why I'm in Peru and why I'm not okay with it. And I need you to know why I was okay in the United States until I wasn't. I'm not totally at peace with this decision. So every day I wake up and ask myself, should I stay or should I go? Welcome to But You Can't Stay Here. For most of my life, whenever people asked me what I considered home, I would tell them it was wherever my family was. For all elementary school, that home was the United States. A very specific version of the late 80s and early 90s in the United States.
So I lived all over the world when I was a kid and decided to officially immigrate to the US as an adult. If I had known healthcare was important, I might have made different choices. But I think part of the reason I did is because I had a certain impression of the US, and that's because, part of my time here as a child was spent in this country. I spent most of my elementary school years in Greenwich, Connecticut. Anyone familiar with Greenwich? Oh, wow, okay, well if you are, you've definitely attended the Ivy League or have been terrorized by someone who attended the Ivy League. I really wanted to end that bit by saying that you're either a member of the Republican Party or you've been terrorized by a member of the Republican Party, but that's literally everyone in this country right now. But living in Greenwich is living in the US in easy mode, it's a special place. Like, Greenwich is the kind of place where casual Fridays are for plebes. Greenwich is the kind of place where a Reese Witherspoon character holds a deep, dark secret. Greenwich is so affluent that the Latino families there have their own Latina nannies to take care of their children.
That's from a stand-up set I did at the Brooklyn Comedy Collective in 2025. My depiction of Greenwich is exaggerated for comedic effect, but it's not too far off. As a kid, I assumed life in Greenwich was the norm, that everyone in the country lived that way. Now, as an adult, I realize how extraordinary it actually was. I'm not the only one who feels that way.
My name is María Jimena Bellina García Rosell, aka Jimena, aka Jime, and I'm your older sister.
I asked my sister about our childhood over the quintessential modern Peruvian mode of communication, voice notes on WhatsApp.
I think in broader terms, our childhood by many, including ourselves, could be considered idyllic. And it was definitely privileged. We didn't lack anything. We had a very structured household. a very traditional family setup, and we had access to the best education and access to things that, let's face it, most people in the world wouldn't necessarily have access to, provided that we lived in certain areas of the world where that kind of thing just happened organically. So we really weren't too aware of it because as children, you just accept your reality as it is. And it's later when you're thrown into the depths of adulthood that you realize just how lucky you are.
In many ways, we were the picture of a traditional family. There was my dad, Jose Antonio, who would commute to Manhattan like so many dads in the suburbs. My mom, Rosa, was a stay-at-home mom. My sister, Jime, was the cool, rebellious older sister. My younger brother, Cote, was a budding soccer superstar from the day he learned how to walk. And then there was me, the studious, bookish middle child. My baby brother, Jorge, would come later, when we were living in Potomac, Maryland. Yes, Potomac of Real Housewives fame. Again, my version of the U.S. was that of TV perfection. Our American childhood involved riding the bus to school, biking to neighborhood parks, spending our summer days at the beach. I remember scholastic book fairs, trick-or-treating with UNICEF boxes in tow, playing the violin in school assemblies. Our proximity to New York also made it so that we would take day trips to the city to go to the Museum of Natural History, Central Park, and musicals. When we moved to Potomac, we swapped the Met for the Smithsonian and walks around Fifth Avenue to Georgetown, but the gist of it remained. We played on sidewalks, went to the mall, and felt safe. But in other ways, we differed enormously from pure Americana.
Our childhood was also nomadic, and we were always foreign. It was completely normal until it wasn't, and then you had to pack your life up at some point and just go, and poof, it all went up in smoke.
I'm going to ask you the question that everyone always asks me whenever I explain our diplomatic, nomadic childhood. Did you like it? They ask with a concerned, raised eyebrow.
I struggled with it a lot. And I know that you and I have different takes on that, and that can be due to 100 million things. It would take a whole team of therapists to get around that.
I always tell them that I really loved it, but that it had a lot to do with my personality, and that I think I just happened to get lucky with regards to where we went, because I know. There you go. Yeah. Sorry, mom was interrupting. Because I know it's not always the norm. I do have a theory about diplomat kids and how they're divided into, you either absolutely hate it and want to stay somewhere for the rest of your life, or you become a wandering soul like me.
Now, my wandering soul status has its benefits. It taught me to adapt quickly. It gave me the enormous gift of realizing that a lot of social mores are constructed and therefore bullshit, in the words of Fiona Apple. It's made me an expert at starting over. But it also has some less than pleasant consequences. I'm restless, rarely satisfied with my station in life, sometimes ungrateful. I have a hard time savoring the present. I always wonder if there are greener pastures out there. And let's face it, moving wasn't always easy. Sometimes it downright sucked. And unfortunately, every time it sucked for me, it was when we moved back to Peru. My country, the place that was always supposed to feel like home. In 1994, after 6 years in the U.S., my dad was transferred back to Lima. I was 11 years old, in the throes of that hormonal cauldron known as puberty. Peru was also undergoing its own transition, after a decade of internal violence unleashed by the guerrilla groups The Shining Path and the MRTA. We were only a couple of years into the Alberto Fujimori presidency, but he had already carried out a self-coup and was on his way to enacting even more authoritarian measures. Even at its best, at another time in history, moving from my coastal, liberal, multicultural U.S. enclaves to Peru would have been an adjustment. But during this period, it was an absolute shock to the system. I didn't have the right vocabulary or political know-how to explain it at that age, but I could tell that the vibes were way off. In an essay I wrote about my experience for Book Riot, I described my culture shock like this. There is a tendency to think that a return to one's country is a joyous process in which the displaced individual is welcomed back into the fold and made whole. The reality is quite different. At the time, my memories of Peru were so brief and limited that it felt like any other foreign location. The nation itself was split open from a decades-long period of terrorist violence. The capital city holds the affectionate nickname of Lima, La Horrible, and its overstated ugliness was never more apparent than in those years. Its perpetual gray skies gloomed over a labyrinth of ash-colored buildings where nothing seemed to work properly. Not lights, not hot water, not traffic signals, not anything that resembled order. And maybe this dire landscape wouldn't have felt as bad if I had found myself in a nice school with nice people who wanted to do nice things. Instead, my parents put us in Salcantay, an all-girls Catholic school run by the Opus Dei, the most conservative, traditional, backwards faction of all Catholic orders. A faction so scary, Dan Brown made an entire villain out of it in the Da Vinci Code.
Salcantay, the best way to describe the school, the building, the grounds, classrooms, kitchen, canteen, whatever you want to call it, was immaculate, which is exactly how they wanted to educate the girls that were going to that school. Be the Virgin Mary. If you're going to have children, better be a virgin at it too.
Now, my sister can often turn hyperbole into an art form, but her assessment here is quite accurate. Salcantay was everything wrong about the status of women in the Catholic Church. The rules were strict, the guilt tripping was strong, and the hems on her skirt had to reach the floor. Class hours were interrupted to pray, go to Mass, and head to confessional. Our education was rigorous, provided we didn't think for ourselves. And everyone around me seemed to be okay with that. In the States, I had gone to public, co-ed schools, the kind that was doing DEI before it was cool and before there was even backlash to what used to be cool. I had spent an entire childhood being told our differences made us great. And now I was in a classroom where I was told everyone who wasn't Catholic was going to hell. And some Catholics too. Maybe even me. Is that why no one wanted to be my friend? They could smell the heathen off of me?
I remember you, again, making friends quicker than I did. You had an easier time making friends. I don't know. I've never asked. But I don't think that you've ever had backlash or pushback or gone into anyone's school with everyone hating you from the second they saw you.
When it came to El Salcantay and friends, no, dude. When I went to El Salcantay in 6th grade as a newbie, no one bullied me, I will say that, but the bulk of the girls there just ignored me, to be honest. I was a nut duck there, but as a girl who was really preoccupied with being a good person, I was also tormented by my lack of torment compared to the rest of my classmates. The girls were really worried about sin. According to them, everything that was remotely fun, from bikinis to reading your horoscopes, was an offense against God. Thankfully, I did meet someone who ended up being my lifeline then and continues to be one to this day.
My name is Rocío De La Puente. Who am I? I'm your friend.
As a kid, I thought Rocío and I were destined to be friends. She moved to Lima from Piura, a city in northern Peru, the same year I moved to Lima. We were the new kid in school, in the very same grade, in the very same class, and we were seated next to each other on our very first day. It couldn't all be a coincidence. Rocío has a less cosmic take.
Mi mamá me había dicho, hay una nueva, igual que tú. Entonces, yo ya tenía clarísimo, yo ya te había puesto los ojos antes de conocerte. Ya tenía clarísimo que me tenía que hacer amiga de la nueva. Y
fue con estrategia.
fue con estrategia, total, sí, de verdad que sí fue con estrategia.
Since her mom had already dished that there was a newbie, Rocío went in that day determined to befriend me. And befriend me she did, despite us being total opposites. She was sporty, while I had my head buried in a book. She was outgoing, while I kept to myself. But we loved board games and roller skating and sided with underdogs, even at that young age, and that was enough to become BFFs. Rocío didn't totally buy everything our school sold us, but she was more used to the Spanish Inquisition-esque aesthetic that permeated the place. Her school in Buda was an Opus Dei school too, and if anything, Buda society was even more old-fashioned than Lima's. But she knew I struggled in Lima, then and later. And that's because after spending 6th and 7th grade in Peru, we moved again. This time to Buenos Aires, Argentina. I highly recommend spending your teen years in Buenos Aires. Gone was the frightened, closed-off, traumatized Lima society and that of my horrid Peruvian school. And in its place, I was in an artsy, vibrant metropolis, the supposed Paris of South America. Argentina had gone through its own political horrors in the 60s and 70s, but it had had a complete opposite reaction than Peru. Teens were encouraged to hang out, date, explore, Love Island style. At 13, you can find me wearing baggy pants, a crop top, and my thick-rimmed glasses, partying until 6 a.m. at the club. I already fancied myself an up-and-coming boho intellectual, and Buenos Aires indulged that delusion. I signed up for theater workshops, partied in day-long music festivals, and submitted shockingly bad poetry to citywide literary conferences. I attended a hoity-toity all-girls Catholic school there too, but religion classes were mostly hour-long venting sessions about the state of the world, with some liberation theology to boot. I loved Buenos Aires. Lima felt like a long-gone, unfortunate blip. But then my dad was promoted again, and our time there was cut short. We moved back to Peru right before my last year of high school, which felt like a personal attack from some sort of god. Probably the fear-mongering version Salcantay preferred.
Yo sí recuerdo haberte visto choqueada de todas las cosas que pasaban en el colegio. O sea, choqueada de mil cosas. O sea, choqueada de las cosas que pasaban en el colegio, choqueada en nuestro círculo social,
Sí.
¿no? Choqueada de nuestros amigos, de las amigas fuera de tus mejores amigas, ¿no? También, de esas otras que no eran tus mejores amigas, pero que estaban alrededor un poco, ¿no?
Rocío describes it well. I was shocked about how little had changed in Lima since I had been gone. My school, still oppressive and stifling. Despite being older and more aware of the ridiculous standards Salcantay set, my friends were still beholden to a lot of Lima's problematic social expectations. This was reflected in silly, benign ways. For example, once they realized I had no curfew, all my friends slept over my house whenever we went out to parties. It was their way of staying out as late as they wanted without their parents freaking out. And it was my way of completing a community service that I felt was sorely needed. But the social pressure was also reflected in more sinister ways. We were grown enough to slut-shame or be slut-shamed, to express casual racism or be subjected to it, to segregate ourselves into our upper middle class bubble and fear being seen with the wrong company. So while my shock at age 11 had to do with realizing the world could be cruel, my shock at 16 was realizing that people my age could be cruel, that the youths were not automatically more progressive than their parents. And if they weren't willing to shake up the status quo, that meant Lima could stay the way it was, forever. El shock de los 11 años fue mucho más interno y creo que también fue mucho más de romper la burbuja de cómo es la vida, mientras que el shock que me vino en Argentina puede ser que haya sido más social en ese sentido, pero también con la seguridad de que yo sentía que yo no era la loca. O sea, yo sentía que el resto estaba loco.
Sí.
Tenía la seguridad de saber que yo en ciertas cosas estaba en lo correcto y no entendía por qué alrededor mío la gente seguía tan cerrada o cucufata. O sea, y más siendo adolescentes. Hay veces que decía como que no tienen ganas de rebelarse. I'm not saying I came back from Argentina with perfect politics or as a civil rights warrior. But I had spent the last 3 years of my life chanting at concerts, El que no salta es militar. If you don't jump, you're part of the military. An allusion to the last right-wing military dictatorship Argentina experienced. Our generation was the first to grow up under democratic rule, and the country's anti-authoritarian streak and egalitarian convictions had nestled into my intellectual development. In Lima, I bristled at how many people around me truly believed their social standing was akin to a fixed natural order, as opposed to sheer dumb luck. But also, didn't anyone want to have fun? You're teens. Rebel. Get in trouble. Later, when I met people outside of my circles, I learned that other teenagers in the city did. A lot of my discontent in Lima had to do with how much of my life was determined by Salcantay. Much like your own teen misery may have been determined by your hyper-competitive Brooklyn private school or your quintessential football-dominated Texas high school. It's part of the fabric of these locations, but it's not their entire story. Because while that final year of school felt like I had been forced into the nunnery, my life in Peru opened wide once I graduated. You'd think after my experience in Salcantay, I would have blacklisted any other Catholic educational institution. But when I graduated, I knew exactly where I wanted to go to college. La Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, or La PUC. Excuse me, La PUC. Why? Because it was full of commies. Kidding! It was full of socialists. Full of wannabe artists, pseudo-intellectuals, grassroots political activists, smart aleck burnouts, intimidating goths, granola baby anthropologists, extravagant theater kids, and ambitious straight-laced law students to give some balance to the whole scene. From our friend group, Rocío and I were the only ones to apply and get in. She was the ambitious straight-laced law student. I was the literature major hoping to be taken seriously by her peers. Para mí, las épocas de la Católica fueron como las épocas más felices que he tenido en Lima.
Te sentiste más como pez en el agua, ¿no? Porque había más pluralidad, ¿no? O sea, realmente tenía gente de todos lados, diferente, con pensamientos distintos, con backgrounds distintos.
Rocío hit the nail on the head. Instead of a fish out of water, I finally felt like a fish in water, pleasantly swimming along. I had finally burst out of my confining bubble and felt like I was surrounded by normal people. I made friends with limeños from all corners of the city, who had gone to all types of schools, and who ranted and raved against the way things were. In fact, they wanted to reimagine what the country could be. We were deep in the Fujimori regime by then, and the university was a flurry of political activity, with protests and heated discussions punctuating much of my time there. But what I most cherish about my Católica years was less noble than that. It was the sheer amount of hueveo I participated in. Hanging out for hours on end at the quad, grabbing some beers in Barranco dive bars, dancing at house parties, my first situationship and my first really irritating college boyfriend. My friends and I checked out art house films, endured experimental theater, started a poetry circle. Real college girl shit. I excelled in my studies. I published my first short story in the university's annual anthology of creative writing. And yet.
You started La Católica, which is the same university I went to. And this is where it gets really tricky because your time in La Católica, I remember it one way and you remember it another way. You know, it's not something that I dreamt up. It's not something I imagined. It's something I lived. But when we've talked about it, you've said that's never happened. I wasn't happy at university. And I kept saying, oh my God, if I stay here, I'm going to end up hating the one thing that I really love to do in this life, which is to draw. Like the biggest fear attached to that was I'm going to hate art. I can't stay here because I feel like I'm going to end up hating art. And this is why it's so striking to me and why it's so seared into my mind. And you came home from university one day and you were in tears and you said, I feel like if I stay here, I'm going to end up hating writing. And I remember this because you were crying and I comforted you. And I told you, Ines, I know exactly how you feel because I felt the same way.
I really don't have memory of that day that you tell me about, but here is what I think might have happened. If I ever came home and I said something like that and crying, I think where the mix up was that I felt that way about Peru, not about La Católica in particular. I couldn't see a way that I could make a career in Peru. I could feel that I would be forced to write in a way that I didn't want to write. And it just felt small. There was no way in hell that I was going to spend my adult life in this country. I feel a little ashamed to admit this, because there are so many people in my country that stayed and fought to make it better. And because the majority stayed because they had no choice, pouring their heart and soul into making their dreams come true here, because what else were they going to do? I know I come off as weak, spoiled, but I also think it's human nature to want more. Back then, despite how much my life had improved in college, I still didn't feel like I belonged. I didn't want to build something. I wanted to simply insert myself into a place that already had it going on. I wasn't sure what the place would be. But after living in the States and Argentina, I believe there were countries that would simply be more amenable to me than Peru ever had been. Peru always felt like a beautiful dress that was too tight on my body. No matter how much I tugged and pulled, I was uncomfortable and ready to burst at the seams. So when my parents offered to send me abroad to finish college, I jumped at the chance. I completed my BA degree at McGill University in Montreal, a city that j'adore. After I graduated, I spent a year in Panama applying to graduate programs while working at a call center. By then, I saw education the way other people see lottery tickets, my one shot to catapult me to a better life. Yes, I was nerdy. Yes, I liked studying. And sure, I could see myself being a university professor. But every choice I made from La Católica onward had little to do with genuine scholastic interest. I had one goal in mind: get the hell out of Peru. When I received my acceptance letter to a fully funded PhD program at Columbia University in the city of New York, I felt like I had made it. It would be smooth sailings all the way till I reached a tenure-track position somewhere in the world, as long as it was in Peru. That was the plan. But as you can probably tell, as smart as I am, I can also be incredibly dense. What I didn't know then was that you can't hack your way into an easy life. You can't skip over the growing pains of becoming an adult in search of belonging. More on that after the break. Join the Patreon community for as little as $3 a month and help keep this podcast going. Benefits include a thank you shout out right here on the pod, a secret food map, group chats, and even a travel itinerary curated by yours truly. Fine, but you can't stay here on Patreon. I recently found my diary from my first year in New York. I expected to read a long and detailed log of my last day in Lima, an entire chronicle of my first day in Manhattan. After all, what a monumental decision I had taken. After a lifetime of changing residencies for reasons that had nothing to do with me, I had chosen my own. What kind of poetics did I wax? Turns out I waxed nothing. I wrote my first diary entry roughly 10 days after having landed and used it to complain. Here it is, translated from Spanish. New York is beating me hard. Nothing's ready. Nothing's easy. My money has turned into smoke, and I don't know when I'll have any again. I have no communication with the outside world except for the internet, which I'm getting because I'm stealing someone's Wi-Fi. I'm not street smart, and I don't have the energy. I hope everything works out soon. Boo! 3 weeks later, I wrote this. There's something suspicious about how quickly I've adapted to my new life. The city has opened its enormous cement arms and wrapped me up in infinite possibilities. Every step I take is new, every road unrepeatable. I've exiled routine, never to return. At least that's my hope. Garcia Lorca is probably rolling around in his grave. Oh, to be broke, young, and in New York. If I didn't write anything in my diary at first, it was probably because I was savoring every minute of freedom before the realities of my highly competitive PhD program set in.
I think we were going out all the time. I think we were just trying to explore the city, and not just like partying, but like restaurants, free festivals.
At least that's what I gather from what one of my closest friends in New York remembers.
My name is Erica Reed. I'm originally from Montreal in Canada, which is how we met. And this year will actually make my 20th year in New York. So I live in Brooklyn now, and I'm a full-time photographer.
Erica and I went to McGill together. We met during a spring break trip to Panama City Beach, Florida that was so epic it lives in infamy and nowhere on social media. We both moved to New York in 2006. The city's indie sleaze scene was just starting, with the American Apparel flagship store in the corner of Houston Street functioning as a ground zero for everything hipster. The Lower East Side reigned supreme. Williamsburg was still affordable, and you could still get a $3 PBR and Max Fish, RIP. Life was good. But as much as this all sounds like a prelude to a girls episode, my life was far from the 20-something shenanigans that dominate any pop culture depiction of New York. I was completely just consumed by my PhD program, which for reasons that I don't comprehend other than maybe just pure ignorance, I thought PhD program was going to be like college, but maybe with a little bit more responsibilities instead of the absolutely time-consuming beast that it was. So what I remember of my 20s in New York was exactly that, being a hermit for several months, then going on some Will Ferrell, old school
Vendors.
rampage for a vendor for a weekend.
I remember
And then going back
honored
library.
to partake in those.
My disenchantment with academia came quick. Now I'm grateful for the many years I spent immersed in big books and big ideas, surrounded by the kind of bright minds who would go on to be nominated for National Book Awards and win MacArthur Genius Grants. I was in over my head, and more importantly, profoundly disinterested in academia as an endeavor. I didn't want to spend my life writing academic essays about authors that would be read by a total of 3 specialists. I wanted to be the author academics wrote about. And though I thought getting a doctoral degree would secure me a job, there were already whispers of how roles in academia were disappearing in cataclysmic proportions. I constantly thought of quitting. There was one problem.
I think we sometimes bonded over this, like, I'm doing the right thing, or I'm doing the thing I came here to do, even though, for you it was a lot of so much time consumption. You were always studying or writing or reading. It was probably when I started working, when you were really starting to be like, why am I living in New York when I'm not getting to really enjoy New York the way I'm seeing my friends enjoy it?
This idea of I'm not enjoying New York the way other people are, I think has been pervasive with my relationship in New York, that I'm like, oh my God, I also felt that way back in my 20s.
Right.
And I mean, part of us sticking things out were because of our dreams and our determination. And yes, our 20-something ego of thinking, well, smart people rise to the top. And now we know that's not the way the world works. But I think we both felt also constrained by visas.
Yeah.
Like I was on a student visa. And I think if I had had residency or citizenship, I would have made the decision to leave that PhD program like after 2 years and just bummed around New York, probably doing what I did later, like stand up or readings or trying to find a job in publishing. But I really couldn't. And I mean, I think for you it was different because you had a student visa and then you had the HB1 visa, right? But that's also tied to work.
Now that you're saying that, now you're jogging my memory, that I think that's something you and I specifically talked about a lot. that we were tied to things in a really limiting way in some ways.
As nomadic as my life had been, it was still a life defined by visas. Remember, I was born in a country that denied me citizenship from the get-go. Living in Switzerland, the States, Argentina, all that implied a visa process. And once granted, that visa had an expiration date. I went through the Canadian and the Quebecois visa process when I went to McGill, and the only reason I could live and work in Panama was because I had a temporary permit through my parents, who were stationed there. As a Peruvian, even tourist travel was tied to lengthy and expensive visas if I wanted to set foot in countries like the UK, Australia, and, well, anywhere that was dubbed developed and white. Visas were a defining factor in that of so many people I knew too. Members of my family had immigrated to Venezuela, the US, Spain, and shared its accompanying headaches. My father came home from work with stories about undocumented Peruvians, or those who were at risk of losing their papers. In Panama, I completed an internship at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. For several months, I interviewed refugees displaced due to the many civil wars that had plagued Central America in the 80s. 20 years later, they were still looking to become full-fledged Panamanian residents, and the Panamanian government kept thwarting their efforts. A visa was not a thing to take lightly. I was hyper-aware that any foreign government could say, "You can't stay here," if that's how they felt. And my student visa in the US was very clear about what I could or could not do. I could only work on campus. If I chose to withdraw from my program, I had 15 days to leave the country. Even if I had taken the bold action to apply for a job and gotten said job, I would have needed that job to sponsor a different visa than the one I had. Browse through any LinkedIn post these days. See how many are willing to undertake that hassle. As miserable as I was in my program, I felt like I had no choice but to stick it out. I didn't want to leave New York. I had a great group of friends. And I also loved my boyfriend, who I met my first year there and moved in with a year after. To drop out of grad school meant turning my back on him and on the version of me that felt I belonged there. So when my live-in boyfriend of 5 years and I decided to marry, I was elated. Elated for all the usual reasons brides-to-be are, but also because I could finally move on with my life. I was no longer going to be beholden to that student visa. I had met the conditions to apply for a green card, that condition being falling in love with an American and having that American love me back. Sheer, dumb luck. I dropped out of Columbia, said goodbye to New York, and headed to Chicago where my fiancé was from, and where I convinced myself my real life lay ahead of me. But of course, it didn't work out that way. What to say of Chicago? I stayed there for 10 years, from 2011 to 2021. The longest I've ever lived anywhere, continuously. In my early years there, I shared my writing in readings all over the city. Through the contacts I made, I started publishing stories in local outlets. I became a fixture in the literary community there, doing everything from producing storytelling shows, to teaching workshops, to moderating panels, to simply being a regular at my favorite bookstore. I made friends, and more friends. And after a while, it was almost a given that I would run into someone I knew by simply leaving my apartment. I participated in all of the Chicago rituals that induct you as one of their own. I took improv classes, I bought a tamale from the tamale guy, I got a little too messy at Pitchfork 2016. I really thought Chicago could make an honest woman out of me. I became a U.S. citizen there. I committed to the bit. I tried to make Chicago my forever home. I really did. But I wondered if Chicago felt the same way. My marriage crumbled only a short few years after I moved there. I barely knew anyone in the city when it happened, and I still marvel at the fortitude I had to rebuild my life, brick by brick, basically on my own, away from my family, away from my friends in New York. After several years, I had one solid great relationship with a man who defected to Portland. A handful of situationships came and went. After struggling to find a job for 2 years, I somehow found myself working in advertising. And I stayed in advertising until the toxic environment and the agency's refusal to raise my salary became too much. I worked in university communications until my role was cut during a massive layoff, a move that was considered unprecedented in higher education. No one would raise an eyebrow about that now. I went freelance after that and worked remotely before COVID-19 made it a thing. I haven't been able to find full-time work since. After several years of putting my best foot forward to get the job, the relationship, and a house to call my own, I realized I had multiple jobs, no relationship, and a below-market rental that felt like it was granted by the grace of God. But cheap rent wasn't enough to stop me from wondering, what was I doing there? Why was I still in Chicago? And there was another nagging thought that I was trying my damn hardest to ignore. I missed Peru. I know so much of what I've said before makes it seem like I have no kind thoughts or feelings towards my country. But we usually bitch the hardest about that which we love the most. And there's so much I love about Peru. I love that I can trace my roots back to a land that has seen entire empires rise and fall. I love its dramatic, erratic landscape, especially the way the Pacific Ocean roars against the Lima cliffs. I love that we are a people made of many people, and that the result was the creation of the most banger cuisine in the entire world. I love that our Catholicism is tinged with Incan rituals, and that everyone has at least one story of a bruja that cured their ailments. I even like that we buck the Latino stereotype of being happy and lively. We are, in fact, morose and kind of grumpy. Peru is a country that gave us poets like César Vallejo and Blanca Varela, novelists like Alfredo Bryce Echenique and Gabriela Wiener, Nobel laureates like Mario Vargas Llosa. It gave us revolutionary leaders like Tupac Amaru and Micaela Bastidas, feminists like Magda Portal and Zoila Aurora Cáceres, modern heroes like María Elena Moyano. We dance over 2,000 traditional dances, play over 1,300 distinct musical genres, and speak over 48 languages. We domesticated the freaking potato. And for as difficult as Lima society is, once you make a group of friends, you're set for life. I miss the relentless teasing that passes for affection among friends in Peru. The way they'll spontaneously drop in on you, and how their families adopt you as their own. I miss my family, which now included 2 nephews. I didn't want to admit it, but I know this to be true because I kept writing about Peru. I wrote personal essays about my life there. I pitched stories about Peruvian cuisine and culture. I wrote notes and notes for novels that took place in Peru. But I could not bring myself to go back. Every time I thought about it, I felt like the immigrant that had failed. What had I to show for myself? One broken marriage and a bunch of went-nowhere relationships? A middling writing career with no agent or publishing deal? Financial instability and credit card debt? How American of me. If I were to return to Peru, I wanted it to be in triumph. As a compromise, I decided to leave Chicago for good and see what else was out there in that big-ass country they call the U.S. When I left Chicago, I posted a small but heartfelt tribute to the city on Instagram. Under a picture of its gorgeous skyline, I wrote, "Chicago, the city where I became who I always wanted to be. For that, you are second to none." I meant it too, but it was time to go. I spent time in Savannah and Austin, visited Philly, Portland, Burlington, hoping something would click. I toyed with the idea of New Orleans, Tucson, even LA for one brief insane minute. In the end, I ended up where I began. I went back to New York just shy of my 40th birthday. From the moment I set foot, it was an unmitigated disaster. Here's Erica again.
There are parts of New York that you really blossomed in, like the readings and your writer community. But I think there was the shared experience of just how hard it can be to be a freelance creative in New York.
Yeah.
In this post-pandemic financial landscape really weighed on you. So I think that was really apparent how stressful that was to you.
It's one thing to be broke in New York and in your 20s, and another to be broke in New York and in your 40s. I worked longer hours, churned more content marketing than ever had in my life, and made more money than ever before, only to share space with a roommate that practiced opera every night. a detail she had conveniently left out when I took the room. I was already barely making ends meet when I got a tax bill that pushed me close to bankruptcy. That very same day, my roommate informed me her boyfriend was moving in and I needed to find a new apartment, with all the moving costs that entailed. And while I loved the new apartment, neighborhood, and roommates I found my second year, my quality of life continued to plummet. I could barely afford bills, let alone anything that makes New York, New York. Dive bars were special treats. Anything else the city had to offer was out of reach. I bought expensive health insurance, because is there any other kind in the States? And still found myself in underfunded community health centers in search of the cheapest copay. My bank account was so low, I used apps to find produce that was on its last leg and sold at bargain prices. They were usually rotten by the time I got home. And there was other stuff going on too, beyond the material losses. I suspect I was under the double whammy of depression and perimenopause for most of those years. Halfway through my time there, the man I had been involved with for close to 3 years decided to break things off. While the breakup had been clean enough, the aftermath was filled with such shockers that I struggled to get out of bed. I felt rejected by him, by the economy, by healthcare, and even by myself. I had very little energy to work on my writing or pull myself from my bootstraps. Again. I really couldn't tolerate having a lot of people talking to me about how, this was the greatest place to be when I was going through hell. I'm like, no city is actually
for sure.
good enough to compensate what I'm going through. I wanted a reset so badly. I knew freelancing wasn't working out, but I couldn't afford to pause and look for a full-time job because I had to pay rent. I knew New York wasn't working out, but I didn't have the money to move to another U.S. city. I knew I should at least take care of my health, but I barely had the strength to take a shower. And then something happened that brought this spiral to a halt, but it nearly killed me too.
I think you getting sick and your hospitalization, to me that was like you needed a break from everything you had endured over 5 years, essentially.
To keep it short, I went into the hospital for emergency gallbladder surgery and ended up in the ICU for a week. In that hospital bed, with a feeding tube down my nose to keep me alive, I took stock of my life. First, I couldn't afford it. Second, I definitely couldn't afford it with whatever medical debt I was about to incur. Third, I was so tired of fending for myself, of having to claw my way into mediocre jobs that never felt like they paid enough, of fighting. Third, of fighting for what exactly? A socially downward freefall? A lifestyle that involved wilting lettuce? No one immigrates to make their life worse. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in rock bottom. I had to find a foundation to climb back up to what I wanted my life to be. Yeah, me getting sick was definitely it was the final push. I wouldn't even call it the final straw, because by the time it happened, I remember feeling very relieved that I could go back to Peru instead of feeling sad. And I think if it hadn't reached that point, I think I would have just felt very defeated.
Yeah.
And instead, when I went back, I was like, I got to do this, bitches. I'm out, At that point, I didn't care anymore that my great American experiment had failed. What I wanted was relief. And that's when I made a decision I never thought I'd make. I decided to move back to Peru. 2 months after my hospital stay, on June 4, 2024, I boarded a plane heading south. My Instagram post that day, a selfie with the caption, "See ya in a bit." So here I am, 2 years and some change after the fact. You're probably wondering if moving back to Peru solved all my problems. It solved some. But if I was at peace, I wouldn't be talking to you right now about the question that I stated at the top. Should I stay or should I go? Whenever I tell cab drivers, acquaintances, and even some friends that I moved back to Peru from the United States, I see the confused looks on their faces. But you can't stay here, they say, urging me to whip out a return ticket to the U.S. post-haste. They see Peru's political instability, brutal job market, broken infrastructure, chaotic traffic, and a series of other flaws, and simply cannot understand why I would ever choose this. But in my final years in the US, as the cost of living soared, housing became a luxury, wages stagnated, and GoFundMe became the most reliable form of health insurance, I heard more and more of my acquaintances, my friends, and even some cab drivers wondering how in the hell they were going to make a life there. Let's be honest, the US government under the Trump administration has made it abundantly clear that they don't want my kind either. And here's the thing. While the reasons for my ambivalence towards Peru and my ambivalence towards the United States are particular to me, to my personality and my personal history, I can't divorce it from the structural issues that weigh down how great both countries could be. I'm willing to admit I made mistakes. I squandered opportunities. I trapped myself into unrealistic and foolish expectations. I know there are people stronger, more resilient, and in all ways more courageous than me that have gone through worse and come out on top. But I also know I'm not the only one questioning what home means and who is struggling to find their place in the world. We are creatures of history, and larger factors, beyond our individual agency, determine the cards we are dealt with. Now, I want to make it abundantly clear that my position is a fortunate one, and I am by no means comparing myself to that of undocumented immigrants who have been targeted, maligned, incarcerated, and treated inhumanely during this cruel, cruel regime. I am not equating my predicament to theirs at all. But I am part of a trend that was, until a few years ago, seen as rare: the United States citizen who leaves. According to research from the Brookings Institution, a record number of American citizens left the U.S. last year, estimating anywhere between 200,000 to 400,000 people. The country is experiencing net negative migration for the first time since the Great Depression. I don't know what your Instagram feed looks like, but mine is flooded with companies offering relocation help to Americans looking to move to the Netherlands, Bali, Italy. Influencers boast about their new digs and their easier pace of life in Colombia, Portugal, or Mexico. And yeah, I have my own conflicting feelings about this too, but what's undeniable is that a lot of people want out. And while I only have anecdotal evidence of this, I've noticed friends and acquaintances who also hail from countries that Trump once described with an expletive, that one that ends with holes, and have opted to go home, dysfunction and all. Whatever American dream they had bought into had proven to be questionable. But even as we all breathe a sigh of relief at some of the pressure we left behind in New York, LA, Washington, San Francisco, or wherever it was we lived in the States, we're also left with doubt. Was this the right choice? Not even 3 of the people I am closest to in the world can come to a neat conclusion. I asked my sister if I should stay here.
Short answer, yes. I think you should stay in Peru for now. I've also told you, you're not a tree. Many times we've discussed this, right? And I think a person should stay somewhere as long as it's working out for them. I don't see you struggling in Peru. I was starting to see you struggle a lot in the States.
I asked Rocío.
Creo que no eres feliz en Perú. Es tan sencillo como eso. Creo que no eres feliz en Perú.
Okay.
O sea, creo que si te quedas, desearía que si te quedas y decides quedarte, sea porque como que ya le diste la vuelta a todo esto que hemos hablado antes.
Well, damn, Rocío. Channeling a founding father, she wonders what would happen to my pursuit of happiness, so she's not giving staying in Peru a full endorsement. I asked Erica.
I think it makes sense for you to stay as a home base as you are entering this new chapter of your career and your life. But I also think you have such a drive to both travel, and for better or worse, there is still such a thriving writer scene in the US that I think you worked so hard to be able to tap into and thrive.
I have a lot of thinking to do, and that's what this podcast is about. Weighing the pros and cons of my 2 countries to see if I can make a deliberate choice about where to stay. There'll be 2 types of episodes. Some are deep dives where I discuss with experts, family, and friends one specific issue that affects my decision, like politics or the economy or the cultural scene. Other episodes will be quick check-ins about my life in Peru, its joys and challenges, and whether there's anything more personal and emotional that is swaying my decision. I hope to gain some clarity, but I also hope it gives you some clarity about what home means to you. Thank you for listening to But You Can't Stay Here. This episode was written and produced by yours truly, Ines Bellina. The show artwork was created by Ines Bellina, who you also heard from in this episode. I also want to thank Rocío De La Puente and Erica Reed for being so willing to talk about me. I also want to give a big thanks to Irene Turner for being our very first member on Patreon. Thank you, Irene, for believing in this project from the get-go. A true patron of the podcasting arts. If you want to join the community and get your very own podcast shout-out, among other perks, find us on Patreon at But You Can't Stay Here. Most memberships also include the paid version of my newsletter, The Cranky Guide, which you can find on Substack. Follow the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and most major podcast platforms. You can also follow the show on Instagram for updates and a look into my Lima life on @ButYouCan'tStayHerePod and me at Ines.Bellina. Finally, please extend your support to your local immigrant rights group. I'm very aware that my indecision is a privilege that many immigrants don't get to enjoy. If you don't know where to start, I've added a list of organizations I like in the US and in Peru on Patreon and Instagram. Till next time, hasta luego.